Grandpa had always taken pride in his little corner of the neighborhood. His house sat neatly at the end of the cul-de-sac, its paint fresh and lawn carefully trimmed. But his pride and joy wasn't the flower beds or even the porch swing. It was his spotless garage. Inside, every tool hung on its pegboard, every box labeled, and his car gleamed as if it were a showroom model. To Grandpa, the garage wasn't just storage, it was his sanctuary. That's why his heart nearly stopped the morning he opened the garage door and froze. Sitting inside, side by side, were not one but two massive pickup trucks. They weren't his. They weren't even parked in front of his house. They were inside his garage, taking up all the space like they owned the place. Grandpa stood in the driveway, blinking, wondering if he was still dreaming. How in the world could someone think it was acceptable to park inside another man's garage? His questions were answered minutes later when Karen, the HOA's loudest and most entitled member, strolled down the sidewalk with a coffee cup in hand. "Oh, good, you found them," she said casually, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "My driveway's being redone, so I needed a place to put the trucks. Your garage faces the street, so it made the most sense. Don't worry, it's temporary." Grandpa's mouth dropped open. "This is my garage, Karen. You can't just—" She waved him off. "Relax. It's community property anyway. We all share the neighborhood, right? You'll hardly notice they're here." Grandpa's face darkened. He wasn't just shocked, he was insulted. Karen hadn't asked. She hadn't even warned him. She had simply decided his private garage was hers to use. And as she sauntered away with that smug grin, Grandpa realized this wasn't an accident. It was a declaration. Grandpa couldn't shake the image of those trucks filling his garage. Later that afternoon, he marched over to Karen's house, determined to set things straight. She was lounging on her porch, sunglasses perched on her nose, sipping from the same oversized coffee cup. "Karen," Grandpa began firmly, "you need to move those trucks. That's my garage, not public parking." Karen tilted her head and smirked. "Oh, come on, don't be so dramatic. The HOA is aware of the situation. I told them my driveway is being redone, and they agreed it was fine. Think of it as doing the community a favor. You've got that big garage, and you hardly use all the space." Grandpa's eyebrows shot up. "The HOA doesn't own my garage, I do. You can't just put your vehicles wherever you like." Karen leaned back in her chair, unbothered. "You're making a fuss over nothing. Besides, I'm on the board, and the board always has the final say. Technically, that makes your garage community accessible property. If you fight me on this, you'll just end up fined for being uncooperative." Her words dripped with arrogance, each sentence meant to shut him down. Grandpa clenched his jaw. She wasn't just entitled, she was weaponizing her position on the HOA board to justify outright trespassing. He tried one last time. "I'm asking you politely." "Move the trucks," Karen waved dismissively. "Not happening. They'll be there as long as I need, and honestly, you should feel honored. Most people would love to help their HOA board. But if you insist on being difficult, don't be surprised when the complaints start rolling in against you." Grandpa walked back home in silence, his blood boiling. Karen's audacity wasn't just shocking, it was dangerous. She thought she was untouchable. But Grandpa knew one thing. Sooner or later, people like Karen pushed too far. Days turned into a week, and the trucks remained firmly in Grandpa's garage. Every time he opened the door, the sight made his stomach turn. His neatly organized space, the one place he valued most, was now cluttered with someone else's vehicles. He couldn't even park his own car inside. Grandpa began documenting everything. He snapped photos of the trucks, recorded videos showing their license plates, and even kept a daily log of when they were parked there. He wasn't about to let Karen twist the story later. When he called the HOA office to report the issue, the response only made him angrier. "We've spoken with Karen," the manager said calmly. "She assured us this is a temporary arrangement. Since she's on the board, we trust her judgment. You'll need to be patient." "Patient?" Grandpa nearly dropped the phone. It was his garage being used without permission, and yet they expected him to stay quiet. He realized then that Karen's influence ran deeper than he thought. She wasn't just ignoring the rules, she was bending the entire system around her. To make matters worse, Karen grew bolder. Some days, she left trash bags in his garage, as if it were a storage shed. Other times, she left her trucks running while parked, filling the space with fumes. When Grandpa confronted her again, she laughed and said, "If it bothers you that much, maybe you should just stay out of the garage for a while." Neighbors noticed the trucks, too. A few whispered to Grandpa that it was wrong, but none offered help. Karen's reputation for bullying anyone who crossed her kept them quiet. Grandpa felt cornered, trapped in his own home. But as frustration bubbled inside him, a new thought took root. Karen believed he wouldn't fight back. She believed her position gave her immunity. That belief was her greatest weakness, and Grandpa was ready to use it. One Friday morning, Grandpa went to run errands, only to find his car completely blocked in by Karen's two trucks. Not only were they still squatting in his garage, but now they were positioned so he couldn't even back his own vehicle out. His hands trembled as he realized what this meant. Karen hadn't just taken his space, she had trapped him in his own home. Grandpa knocked on her door, his patience stretched to the limit. When she answered, she wore that same smug grin. "Problem, old man?" she asked, sipping her coffee like she'd been waiting for him. "Yes, there's a problem," Grandpa snapped. "Move your trucks." "Right now." Karen leaned against the doorframe. "Not happening. The driveway crew said my pavement won't be ready for another week, so you'll just have to deal with it. Besides, you don't have anywhere urgent to go. You're retired. What's the rush?" The dismissiveness in her tone was worse than the words. She wasn't just ignoring his rights, she was mocking him for daring to object. "I'll file a complaint," Grandpa warned. "This is trespassing," Karen smirked. "File away. The HOA board always sides with me. Maybe I'll file a complaint against you instead, for harassment. Then we'll see who's laughing." Grandpa walked back to his house, his jaw tight, his anger simmering. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore, it was an outright power play. She wanted control, and she thought he was powerless to stop her. But she underestimated one thing. Grandpa had lived a lifetime of solving problems. He wasn't about to let someone like Karen strip him of his dignity or his property. By the time he reached his porch, his frustration had hardened into resolve. Karen had pushed too far, and now it was time for Grandpa to push back. Grandpa didn't waste any more breath on arguments. Instead, he turned to action. One afternoon, when Karen's two trucks were parked snugly inside his garage again, he quietly lowered the garage door. With a satisfying clunk, he turned the lock, sealing them in tight. He stood there for a moment, the corners of his mouth tugging upward. For the first time in weeks, the garage felt like it belonged to him again, even if only symbolically. Those trucks were now prisoners, and Karen's arrogance had finally met a wall she couldn't drive through. Grandpa didn't rant or storm over to her house. Instead, he strolled back inside, picked up the phone, and calmly called the sheriff's office. "Yes," he said evenly, "I'd like to report unauthorized vehicles on my property. They're locked in my garage right now if you'd like to come take a look." The dispatcher assured him an officer would be on the way. Grandpa poured himself a glass of sweet tea, walked out to the porch, and sat down in his rocking chair. From where he sat, he could see the garage, the street, and the curious neighbors starting to peek out their windows. Minutes later, a sheriff's cruiser pulled into the driveway. Two deputies stepped out, looking amused as Grandpa explained the situation and showed his documentation. Photos, videos, even the logs. He had it all ready. The deputies nodded, clearly impressed by how thorough he'd been. "Don't worry, sir," one of them said. "You've done everything by the book." "This'll be handled." Grandpa leaned back in his chair, the sun setting behind him, and took another sip of tea. For once he felt calm. The trap was set. Now all that was left was to wait for Karen to walk into it. Karen returned just as the deputies were finishing their notes. She pulled into the driveway in her smaller SUV, music blaring, and stepped out with her usual air of superiority. The moment she spotted the sheriff's cruiser, though, her smile faltered. "What's going on here?" she demanded, striding up the driveway. "Why are you at my garage?" Grandpa stood slowly from his rocking chair. "It's not your garage, Karen, it's mine." "And those trucks you parked inside? They're being treated as what they are, trespassing." Karen's jaw dropped. She marched up to the deputies, her voice rising. "This is outrageous. I'm on the HOA board. I had every right to use that garage. My driveway's under construction, I needed the space." "He's harassing me!" The deputies exchanged glances before one of them spoke. "Ma'am, property lines are clear. This garage belongs to him, not the HOA. You had no right to store vehicles here without his permission." Karen's face flushed red. "You don't understand. The deputy cut her off. The board doesn't override private property law. You can explain it to the judge if you like, but right now you're looking at trespassing and possible fines." The neighbors, drawn by the commotion, began gathering on lawns and sidewalks. Whispers spread quickly, and then came the chuckles. For once, it wasn't Grandpa who looked small, it was Karen. She stomped her foot, furious. But the sheriff's firm tone silenced her protests. "You need to move those vehicles today. And if you set foot or wheel on his property again without permission, you'll be cited." Karen sputtered, glaring at Grandpa as though she'd been betrayed. But Grandpa only gave a calm nod, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. The battle was over, and the victory was his. By sundown, the trucks were gone, hauled away by a pair of tow rigs Karen had reluctantly paid for. The deputies lingered until the last one left the garage, ensuring there would be no further misunderstandings. Once the doors were finally shut, Grandpa locked them with a brand-new chain and heavy-duty padlock just to send a message. Neighbors, still gathered across the street, broke into applause. Some cheered openly, while others just smiled with relief. They had all endured Karen's antics in one way or another, but seeing her plans collapse so publicly gave them a sense of justice. One neighbor muttered with a laugh, "Should have known better than to mess with your garage." "Frank?" Grandpa chuckled softly and tipped his cap. He wasn't one to gloat, but even he couldn't deny it felt good to finally see Karen answer for her arrogance. Karen, red-faced and fuming, stormed into her SUV and sped off. Everyone knew she'd stew over this, maybe even try to come up with some new scheme. But now, the sheriff's warning hung over her head like a storm cloud. She had crossed a line, and she knew it. As the crowd dispersed, Grandpa leaned back into his chair on the porch. The evening breeze carried the smell of cut grass and the quiet peace of a neighborhood finally at ease. He took a slow sip of iced tea, watching the sun dip low behind the tree line. For him, the message was clear. Respect goes both ways. And for Karen, perhaps it was finally time to learn that no amount of HOA titles, expensive cars, or empty threats could outrun the simple truth. Private property is private, and those who trample on it will always face the consequences. So the question remains, when someone like Karen tries to take what isn't theirs, would you let it slide, or would you stand your ground like Grandpa did?